Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We have a dual seminar today. So our speaker, I'll introduce in a second, is going to be giving the BME seminar, but this is also a neuroprosthesis seminar sponsored by the FES Center. So we're having a dual purpose, double your pleasure kind of thing. So our speaker today is Marom Bikson, who is one of our alums. And he's now currently a professor at in biomedical engineering at the City College of New York. It says here he's an expert on neural engineering. We'll reserve judgment on that. No, I'm kidding. He's also associate editor of the Brain Stimulation Journal. Just very quickly, we have some upcoming events. So let's see. We have 3 neuroprosthesis seminars that are coming up. You can look online at what they are. Arun Jeremianan is coming from Northwestern University on March 20th, and he's going to talk about basically some AI in rehabilitation. Alex London is coming from Carnegie Mellon. He's an ethics expert for neural kinds of activities, and Levi Hargrove is coming also from Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, and he does prosthetic work. We also have First Tuesdays. I'm not going to read through these, but these are great opportunities for people to go and present their ideas to an internal crowd. We have several people planned here: Chris Bulliam, Rebecca Stinson, Mark Walker, Michael Fu, and Bride. They present their most recent work, or maybe they present some crazy idea that they have and they want to get feedback. And it's up the hill at the Fairmount. It's a nice atmosphere, some food, some drink, and good discussion. So without further ado, Marom, please take it over.
All right, everyone, thanks for coming. It is really, really special for me to come back here. It's like, it always, for me, like, scientifically, this is like coming home. Like, I feel like this is where I was born as a scientist, and every day when I go to work, I'm practicing things that I learned here. So that's why it's such a pleasure to come here today. And I want to tell you about something called wearable disposable electrical stimulation, or wearable disposable electrotherapy or neuromodulation. This is actually something that I've been working on in my lab for almost half a decade. And this is the first time I'm going to be talking about it myself publicly. We sort of kept it close for a long time. All right, so this is what I looked like in 2000. And there's Dominique. My PhD here was very much about using electricity in order to treat epilepsy, using a variety of animal models. And so this was, we're now 24 years later. So this is Dominique now, and I actually think he looks better after 24 years. I don't think time has been as kind to me. I look worse than he ever has. But the one question I would want to ask is, in these past 25 years, right, like a quarter of a century, how much has, oh, there he is right there. Dominique, I was just talking about how well you've aged. So in the past quarter century, the question I would ask is, from the perspective of patients, right, showing up in the hospitals here around the world, how much has their care using electrical stimulation improved in the past 25 years, right? And my suggestion would be that, in fact, in this domain, and I think many other domains, the answer is unfortunately rather limited. And I kind of want to talk about maybe why that is. Because on the one hand, there's a lot to be excited about as far as electrical therapy. One of the things that made me fall in love with it when I was Dominique's student, when I was here, is the notion that, I think in many other aspects of biomedical engineering and medicine, there's a sense you're working on a therapy, but that therapy might be 20 years away, might be 100 years away, right? But when you are here, working on electrical therapy and neuromodulation, it's possible that you have an idea as a first-year PhD student, and by your 5th year, maybe that's being tried on a human being, right? We have that arc, and there has, as a result of that, been massive technological innovation, right? Nowhere more than in CASE in the areas of neuromodulation, and to some extent rapid translation. But it's also the case that we're very much aware that for all our excitement and progress with electrical therapy, medicine is basically drugs, right? If your cousin goes to the doctor and they're sick with A, the doctor's going to write a prescription. It's not going to be for electrical therapy, right? It's not going to be for a little stimulator, right? It's going to be for a drug, right? And when you walk to the pharmacy, and there's that whole section on whatever it is that you're suffering from, it's drugs and creams and drugs and creams. So we know that this is the case. And it's not that drug therapy has been around longer than electrical therapy, right? They've actually been around, interestingly, they have a long history, it's the same. But we certainly have big pharma. We have big medical device companies. We don't have big electrotherapy. And this is something that I think about, right? Why is that? Again, to ask that question. And I think one reason that there is a massive difference in the use of chemicals in medicine as opposed to electricity is not because of efficacy and safety. I don't think it's simply because of that, right? That would be a simple thing to say, well, the electricity doesn't work, right? I don't think that necessarily in all cases stands up. What I really think is that there's been a difference in distribution. How we get these therapies out to patients in the marketplace. And I think that is, I'm sure, of course it's not the only barrier, but I think that has been a major barrier. And so that is the barrier that we set our attention to. So let me explain what that barrier is like. I want to focus specifically on non-invasive electrical stimulation, but you can think about something with invasive as well. What is that experience like? Well, the patient would be going to CVS, or they're going to be prescribed a device that's packaged, and has the cables and connectors, right? And you need the durable equipment, but you also need these disposable electrodes, right? At every use, you have to connect the electrodes and then disconnect them, right? And so then that has to be carried around everywhere. So now you're doing that, and I guess in your bag. And then, okay, maybe it's a little bit of exaggeration, right? But you have to set it up every time. So every time you have to take it out of the box, you have to take the cables out, you have to connect it to the electrodes, right? Stick the electrodes where they're supposed to go. Then you have to go to your device, power it on. Oh, I forgot to charge it. Now I have to charge it to replace the battery. I have to program it. What is this thing called Hertz? I don't even know. And then you have to program it all up. And then there's still some level of associated waste, right? Because these electrodes themselves are disposable. And maybe ultimately you're going to be throwing away the durable equipment as well. So what about, and I would also say that, there's beautiful work in this space. I'm not trying to be dismissive about it. A lot of the work often tends to be about adding more complexity. Where you're talking about invasive or non-invasive, it's always more channels, AI, whatever, right? That thing, right? And all that stuff, telemedicine. So we're not moving towards less complexity. We're moving towards increasingly complex technology. So I want to suggest an alternative vision, which is what we're calling wearable disposable electrical stimulation or wearable disposable electrotherapy, where in this vision, you would be getting your electrical therapy in the same way that you're getting your pills or your creams, right? And it would be packaged per indication, right? And it would be packaged with individual doses. So these would be individual strips. You could carry those strips, you could fold them up. They would be durable, they would be robust. And then, and at whatever convenient and discrete time you wanted, you would apply those strips as prescribed. There would be no switches, there would be no controls, they would automatically discharge. And it would be very discrete, and when it was done, you would throw it away. Right? So instead of TENS, instead of migraine stimulation, instead of all these others, this is the vision that we worked on, and so this is what we made, right? This is wearable, disposable electrical stimulation, right? This is what these technologies actually look like. They're incredibly thin. In fact, most of the thickness comes from the enclosure itself, and I'm going to describe how these things work, and you can make them in all kinds, as I'll show you, in all kinds of different form factors. All right, now I'll explain to you what it is and how it works, and many more technical details can be found at this preprint. So these were sort of our design inputs. We were thinking about this vision. As I already mentioned, we wanted to really focus on the user experience. So what that means is that the device is activated upon contact. It's not as there's no knobs, there isn't even an on switch, right? So it's closing the circuit that makes it. There's no connections, there's no cables. there's nothing. So there's no settings at all, right? We don't even want to think of this as electrical stimulation. This is just wearable medicine. It just, instead of swallowing the pill, right, you put it on. That's all. It's as transparent to the person. It was very important, of course, that we are using environmentally sound materials that are also very cheap and abundant, right? This is going to be single use. It's going to be thrown out. People have to be comfortable with that decision. And as a result of that, we decided to use no electronics. So this is controlled electrical stimulation. We're controlling the intensity, we're controlling the duration, right? But we're going to do all this without allowing ourselves to use any electronics of any kind. So think about that, and I'll show you how we sort of tried to solve that. Obviously, it needs to be cost effective. It needs to be scalable, right? Because now it's not one stimulator per person, right? It's just like pills, right? You're going to be making one dose at a time. And as we did that, we really wanted to rely on methods that were maybe deployed in a novel way, but were established large-scale manufacturing methods with the ultimate notion that it would be distributed just like a drug. And so the dose is built into the strip itself, right? And as I'll show you, it's also possible to do things like impregnate these with drugs, to do things like electrically enhanced drug delivery, and I'll show you examples of that as well. So these were sort of our big picture design inputs. As I mentioned already, this is what the device looks like, and I'll go through in more detail. In principle, it's relatively straightforward. You have a pouch, right? And everything, all the active ingredients, so to speak, right, are inside the pouch itself. The pouch is perforated at 2 locations that represent the interface. And when the pouch is placed on you, that completes the circuit, and therefore that initiates the discharge, right? So it's the connection, right, that will activate the device. And the device here needs to regulate the discharge, right? So whatever's happening inside here is what's regulating the discharge. And so it ended up being a rather complicated engineering challenge. The device that you're looking at here, right, has in certain places up to 14 layers, but there's really a 3-dimensional structure that is formed sequentially by printing different layers. You'll obviously have things like the battery elements itself, a variety of interconnects, stimulating electrodes. We had to think about a whole lot of types of technology, right? That, at least for me as a more electrical engineer type person, these were more material science type questions, and so we had to collaborate with a lot of people in material science and in battery chemistry. So I'm going to try to describe to you at a high level how those components worked. I do want to say though up front that another major constraint we made on ourselves was that this would be using established scalable printing methods. So everything is made using additive techniques, right? So you could imagine this ultimately being something like a roll-to-roll manufacturing where these could be spit out one after the other. As I'll go through the process, what I'll try to make it clear is the general principle is that you would start with the substrate that you're going to be printing on, but that is also the enclosure itself. So you can imagine that initially you're going to be cutting the substrate, right? And then you're going to start printing, right? You're printing all the layers, and in the final step, you close it, and then you seal it, right? And so that was sort of the approach that we developed that we thought would support scalability, and I'll talk about some of these elements in more detail. So at the core of it are these batteries that, like all batteries, would have your anode and cathode material and your separators and your current collectors. There's a lot of engineering already developed around batteries. So we were adapting a lot of existing techniques, and the devices that I have here are really based around like conventional alkaline chemistry, but modified to our purpose. Individual battery cells, or depending on the chemistry, are only going to be producing about 1.5 volts. Now, depending on the application, that is not enough voltage. We don't have electronics to step up the voltage, and so what we do is we print these batteries in such a way that we can then connect them in series, and you can almost see here that there are individual cells in front of it, right? This is the largest pack that we make, so you might have 14 cells, but you could have 3 cells, you could have 1 cell. This is just a single cell, just to show you what it looks like. All right, and so that's another, and we had to figure out how to print these in a plane, but then stack them up so that they're in series. It was a major project, so that each battery is a sealed compartment, so we had to figure out how to seal it. And so this is looking at the glue that we're using, and the separators are applied at the same time. Additional technology that we had to figure out was we had to create this venting system. So these are extremely small venting channels that include what are essentially functional one-way valves, because these batteries will generate gas as they operate, and that because we have a soft enclosure, right? It will otherwise expand the enclosure. It's not like a metal can battery, and so we had to develop this technology as well to figure out how to do the venting, which is important for shelf life. And yet another technology we had to develop is, while everything is inside, the one thing that's not inside is the stimulation electrode and the hydrogel, right? Because that's what connects to the person, right? So that cannot be inside the plastic. That has to be outside. So we're sticking the hydrogel on the outside, and then we have to create these pass-through connections from the hydrogel, right, into these additional interconnects that then pass through. So these also had to be designed, and then on top of everything else, there had to be a lot of work on conformability. It's not so much stretchability. I wouldn't say these are necessarily stretchable, but for each individual application, they had to be able to sit appropriately, right? And so we thought of a lot of different ways to do things because of the way this case, these are the individual batteries with their interconnects. You can think about that you have these sort of axes of bending that you can make. You could do all kinds of pattern cuts, as I'll show you with different examples. You could talk about narrow designs. I'll show you different implementations. And all these constraints that I'm just talking about now have to be dealt with at once, right? Which is why it's a very integrated design process. Another thing, which I thought was very interesting, and I thought maybe this audience would find interesting, is how the discharge itself works. Now, it is not strictly voltage control, and it's not strictly current control. Rather, there's an interplay between the battery pack and the dynamic load. When you put a conventional battery, right, on your skin, right, it doesn't have its own ability, right, to regulate how much current is applied. Right? Usually in an electronics device, you'll have another piece of electronics that is regulating what the battery does. But now we don't have the benefit of that. So the batteries themselves need to be engineered in such a way to regulate the discharge. And this is a bit problematic because these batteries are highly nonlinear. As the batteries are discharging, their internal impedance changes, their voltage changes, and their current changes, and that in itself will change their internal, right? So it's a very dynamic system. But the load is also very dynamic because the resistance of the body will change as you apply current to it. So as you apply current to the body, its resistance will change, right? But that, of course, will affect what the battery pack is doing, which will then change what the body is doing, right? And all these are rather complicated to model. So this is the approach that we came up with. It's a three-step process. The first step process is we just use a source meter, basically a constant current source, and we used a particular interface that we're interested in. Maybe it's the Band-Aid design, we're using the specific hydrogels that we have to do, and we're doing a very straightforward experiment. We're applying constant current over a period of time, and we're measuring the resulting voltage. So this is the kind of relationship that you might see. It's very common as you apply current for the resistance of the body to drop as a result of applying this current. So this is the relationship that you're seeing here. But how much drop you get is also going to be increasing with the amount of current that you apply. So this is a very robust relationship, but it's going to depend on where you put the electrodes and on the hydrogel. So you see here time, current, and load. So this is a very specific experiment. We then do a different experiment where we take the battery cells themselves and we discharge them under constant current. So this is not connected to the body. We're just pulling current off of them, right? So first we'll pull current off at a rate of 1 milliamp. Then we'll pull current off at a rate of 2 milliamp. And as we pull the current off the batteries, we measure the voltage on the batteries themselves. So here's the current being pulled off over time, and here's the voltage being generated on the body. And I want to emphasize this and this are very different types of experiments, right? This is an active system, right? This is a system that's responding, right? But you'll notice that in both cases, we have current, time, and battery. And so we thought, well, what if we were to overlay these plots? right? The plots are plotted in the same space, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the, let me go back here. We're going to overlay these plots. And where they intersect, we essentially have a trajectory, right? We have time, and we have voltage, and we have current. This is a complicated nonlinear system, and I'm a complicated nonlinear system. But what I do know is that, Duran, does I know how complicated I am? A little bit. Maybe this is more complicated than me, but what I do know is this. When I connect this voltage on the output of the device and my voltage, where I contact it, must be the same. I'm forcing those voltages to be the same. And I also know that the current that's coming out of the device must be the current entering me, right? So we force an equality between the voltage and the current. And so this led us to this notion that by independently characterizing the load and independently characterizing potentially hundreds of different battery designs, we can then figure out what is the right battery design that with the load would facilitate the design. So this was our design process, because again, there were hundreds of design decisions in designing these individual battery elements, and obviously you couldn't quite test them all. So this was a theory, and it turned out that the experimental results pretty well corresponded to it. Okay, so the point of this technology is that it can be tuned to different use cases. And I want to talk about three use cases that we're thinking a lot about. One would be stimulation of the brain. This could be transcranial direct current stimulation, or just maybe cranial nerve stimulation, so putting electrodes here, and there's a lot of applications here. Another application is, it's already well established that you could use electrical stimulation in order to enhance the delivery of drugs into the body, and this is using onto-phoretic drug delivery. But this is, again, using these conventional devices. There's also been a lot of work on using electricity to accelerate healing, and especially accelerate healing on the periphery. So we're not trying to come up with new use cases. We're just trying to see whether our platform could work for these use cases. And in each case, we need to start by describing the dose, right? What is the appropriate current range? So TDCS could use several milliamps. Whereas wound healing is down at around 50 microamps. Based on prior literature, how long would the therapeutic dose be? What would the interface be? What would be the electrode size, right? So these are these sort of, the lower ones are these geometric factors, right? But these are the essential dose factors. And you can see they're not the same, right? These are not going to be the same kind of devices. And so this is what these devices end up looking like. This is a device that would sit across the forehead, a prototype for iontophoresis, and then a wound healing device. Just to highlight a few design features, in this case, you can see that there are 4 cells. It ends up that they're not the same types of batteries in each case. This part is a little bit more rigid. That's where the batteries are. This part here is a little bit more flexible. It's really just the hydrogel. And there's an interconnect that runs through this point here that can fold. In the case of iontophoresis, it's not hydrogel electrodes, rather it's these saline sponge electrodes, traditionally how it's done, because you would sort of formulate your chemical and you would saturate the sponge. And there's also maybe, instead of thinking simply in terms of current and time, you might actually be thinking about charge as far as the amount of delivery. And then, and you could think of putting all kinds of drugs in there, right? You could put painkillers, you could put Botox, you could put vaccines, right? You can put a lot of stuff theoretically in there in order to enhance and control their delivery. So with wound healing, the form factor is something like this, where you have the wound, and over it we're putting some sort of conventional non-woven felt. We don't want to put the hydrogel, or certainly not a metal, over the wound itself. And then you have the hydrogels on either side. And these hydrogels, they serve 2 roles. They serve the role in a regular Band-Aid, that they hold the Band-Aid in place, but they're also where we apply current. Right, so current is being applied across the hydrogels, and that's how it's being passed into the wound, right? And so you see, we need to be very aware of the electrode montage, obviously, because that's going to govern where the current flows. We use computational models. These are just basic predictions of where current would flow through the brain. If you put this on your arm, again, this is the largest device. If you put the device across your finger, it's not a huge shocker. That current will basically be restricted to under and between the electrodes, but we can also predict the associated impedances. And then very importantly, this is data that's measuring the actual discharge on a person. I'm just showing you exemplary data from a single person, but here's the current when the prototype device is put across the head. The current increases to a target level, and then it decreases over time. This is the iontophoresis device, and this is the wound healing device. And again, notice that this device is operating at 40 microamps, and it's keeping it steady for over 2 hours, right, by design, whereas this device is all the way up at 4 milliamp, right, and it starts to decrease very quickly over 20 minutes, right? And this is the batteries, this is a function of the batteries and the active elements themselves. This is some data. So as far as actually running the trials, one of the things we've been doing is we've been using a rodent skin injury model to validate the wound healing capabilities themselves. And again, based on prior literature, we were expecting to see a therapeutic effect. It's more about just using our form factor to validate it. So this is what the rodent wound healing device looks like. The rodent one actually is shaped very much, it's pretty close to a human one, just because of the nature of the style. This is already a computer simulation. You can see where the skin has been punctured, and this is a prediction of where the electric field will go. It's always very important to us. This is a validation that when these are individual animals, that when you put it on the actual animals itself, you're getting the prescribed dose, right? So in this case, the target was around 250 microamps, and the goal was for these things to exhaust themselves at 120 minutes. And this is what a wound healing result would look like. These are just photographs of the wound themselves. Stimulation is applied for, it's a 2-hour session, and it's repeated day after day after day. So it's like you put on a Band-Aid, you take it off, the next day you put on a new Band-Aid. We can either use Band-Aids with active material or just the same thing, but there's no batteries inside of them. So there is a natural rate of wound healing, right? And we document a faster rate of wound healing with the stimulation. You can also notice that there's sort of this, it appears to be that it's healing in this sort of like oblong pattern that may be related to the direction of the current flow, but that is something that we need to validate. So we are confirming extensive prior literature that electricity can accelerate wound healing. It's just that now we're doing it with a fully sort of self-enclosed wearable auto-discharging device. So to conclude, what I've tried to convince you is that we have made progress towards wearable, disposable electrotherapy, and that it is conceivable that these devices would be sent out in a dose-specific way, right? Here's the migraine one, and here's the wound healing one, right? And that's how they would be packaged in sort of these single-use form factors. Because of that, they could be distributed a lot like medicine, right? Like conventional medicine. You would simply get the package. You would just get it's like a Band-Aid, right? It's just a Band-Aid. For some reason, it has an accelerated wound healing factor in it, right? Or it's a back pain patch, and you put it over your back. And so we think that's important. And again, the notion is that as I've tried to show you, it's possible to customize these for different applications. So it's really many potential use cases. We think that there's a lot that's attractive about the user experience, right? You can take these with you everywhere, right? You can put it under your shirt, you know what I mean? When you're at work, we're estimating that the cost of goods is only going to be about a quarter or less at scale per device, so they can be very cheap. They can be deployed. I don't know, you can put them in a suitcase, right, and drop them from an airplane. We put a lot of work into ensuring that this was going to be environmentally benign and dematerialized. And I want to emphasize, in conventional non-invasive electrical stimulation, you still have disposable electrodes. We have not introduced disposable electrodes. All non-invasive electrical stimulation has to have disposable electrodes. In fact, those disposable electrodes often have these, by our standards, rather large metal pins in them for the connection. So we have not introduced a disposable element. What we're just saying is now that's all there is. there's no longer a stimulator. The disposable electrode is the entire unit, and so our devices are as dematerialized as just the disposable electrode components that exist, again, without any electronics, in methods that we think are scalable and which are benign. So thank you for your attention. Yes?
So the design you have is in a bipolar fashion, right?
Yes.
So can you comment about, is it possible to go in a different configuration, tripolar, or it is designed this way that you can have just a bipolar anode and cathode?
That's a
How
good
hard
point.
would it be to change that design?
Yeah, I can tell you what I think would be easy, and I'll tell you also what I think is going to be very hard. I don't think it would be problematic. In this case, obviously, there's one anode and one cathode. Remember, this is direct current, so the polarity doesn't change. It wouldn't be difficult, for example, to have another anode and cathode, right, to maybe make it paralyzed, right? It also wouldn't be difficult to have an anode, cathode. In fact, this configuration here, I don't know if you saw, is a tripolar configuration, right, where you have a single anode and a single cathode. So I think based on what we know, those things are not difficult. However, it's also the case that a lot of electrical stimulation is not direct current, as I've shown you, but it's actually pulsed. That is a harder challenge, right? So how do you generate something that at least oscillates, right? And that is a bigger technical challenge. There are approaches out there, things like off-FETs and things of that nature. Or even though I'm saying we could add a little bit of electronics. So those are the kind of things I think is an open category. But I don't feel limited by direct current because first of all, there's a lot of applications that already use direct current, like the accelerated wound healing, TDCS. So there's a lot of applications that already use direct current. I also think there's a lot of applications that use pulsed that could work with direct current. So there may be applications, for example, for migraine where you stimulate the trigeminal nerve and you use pulse stimulation. But if I put this here, you'll feel it. So the direct current is still capable, right, of activating, for example, peripheral nerve. So it may be possible to use direct current for things like TENS. We may not need to sort of add in the pulse technology, but then it would be on us to demonstrate that we achieve the same functional effects. So if that is a long answer to your question. Yeah.
I was going to ask about why no electronics. I mean, it seems like a few transistors or something doesn't really make it more expensive. Maybe it does make it more complicated.
It's an excellent question. And so now the question is, could you do a little bit of electronics, right? And once again, there's a lot of technology we can leverage. Like you have these RFID tags, right? They're everywhere. They're already disposable, right? And they're using this sort of very sophisticated type of printing technology, right, to make them work. So you could argue, well, that's incredibly dematerialized. People are already comfortable with that being a disposable technology. Could you bring that in as well? And of course, there are also, right, I mean, there's ASICs. You could talk, there are chips that are the size of a grain of rice, right? How much would that do it? And so we're very open to that. But again, that doesn't mean that we still can't leverage what we have, right? So we still have the ability to make highly dematerialized batteries. We still have the ability to step up the voltage, right, without relying on it. So I think even if we were to bring in electronics light, right, the kind of technologies we have now would moderate how we would use them. And as far as acceptability, right, there's the question of, are people going to be comfortable throwing something away, right? So if you say, okay, that has no electronics in it, what is that acceptability, right? Versus to say, well, it has some electronics in it, but it's the size of the grain of sand. And we're very, very sensitive to that because of this notion that we think that has a lot to do with why electrotherapy is not more widely adopted. Plus, I mean, there's other little features, like we can go into an MRI, we don't have to worry about it, right? There's other maybe little features to not having to worry about electronics. But I agree, and so we're thinking about hybrid approaches as well, yeah.
So, thank you. That was very clear. Skin, it comes in all types of, thicknesses and drynnesses and all of that, and it seems like, the load that is put in between there controls how the current is delivered and the time. So, can you comment on maybe the challenges and
Yeah. So that is something that the notion of resistance, right, impedance to non-invasive electrical stimulation is something that, for other reasons, I've been very interested in for a very long time. And it is correct that different people are different, and so that this physiological load is not fixed. You may have someone who is presenting with, what is maybe effectively 1 kiloohm, and someone else who's presenting, let's say, effectively a 10 kiloohm. Now, when you have a current control device, well, you can overcome that, right? Because you'll ensure a comparable current, though incidentally maybe not a comparable electric field, right? Because you're not starting from the same point. And so that is something that so our approach, as I mentioned, is we first characterize the impedance for the particular device that we want to use, and we do that over a significant amount of people. And so we're getting these plots, right, of how impedance changes over time. But what I didn't show, I showed it sort of for one individual. These are varying across all these different individuals. But we have that data. And then, right, we have our battery pack data, right, for a particular battery pack design. And so now if there's 20 people here and I've characterized everyone's impedance, and I know which battery pack I want to use, I can simulate, right, what would be the discharge pattern on all 20 people, right? And if I am confident in that simulation that I'm going to be able to sort of restrict current within an acceptable range, then I can go ahead and build it and then validate it. So what you're saying is an absolute central problem, but there is a way to manage it, right? We have, that's sort of exactly why we needed this type of approach. Otherwise, how would you go about it? So this step is definitely across multiple individuals. I should also say this, so even under best case scenarios, try to find an example, right? It's not exact, right? I mean, the reason why this is different than that probably has more to do with the rats than the individual battery packs that were built. So even after doing everything I've said, we're not going to get it right, and it's possible that device on me is 2 milliamp, and if Dominique uses it, it's 3 milliamp. And that is something sort of that maybe we can become comfortable. We may need to become comfortable with that as well. So when we have current control devices, we can apply the standard of, I have 1% tolerance, right? And that's what my standard is. And with these, to address your question, we will need to accept the fact that that we're going to get some differences in the duration, we're going to get some differences in the time, and that we will have to accept that.
So in terms of specifications for the device, would you design this for the skin that has largest impedance or the median? How?
That's a great question. Ideally, you'll be able to make a device that can accommodate. And there are tricks that, there are ways that you might be able to do that. But another alternative that we thought about is there might be the high dose and the low dose, right? Just like when you have pills, and you would somehow need to know that, you are, you should get the extra strength version. That's not a technical answer. It's just saying, in principle, you can try to make something that works somewhat well for everyone, or you could have something where you have individual doses to accommodate for that. But we worry a lot about these individual differences in impedance, but there's also the fact that we have different nervous systems and different migraines and there's a lot of other variability built in. Maybe that isn't the one we should be most worried about, but
What does that cause more variation than interpersonal differences?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, well, I don't know about sweat, but certainly like makeup, sunscreen, and other things. Anything you put on your skin is going to have a major impact. So our current protocol is right that when someone comes in, we do clean the skin, and so. Everything I'm showing you so far is dependent on that.
Is anybody going for a run after putting one on?
To what?
Sweating at first and then they get sweaty?
I would imagine that it would make a difference. It does. I mean, I'll tell you something else that makes a difference is temperature. So something we realized is that the discharge of these batteries depends on temperature, right? Batteries are very sensitive. Okay, but now, this is a room temperature. But now when I place it, my body is heating it. And so actually we're doing these bioheat transfer models where we're modeling and measuring how much these things heat up when they're applied. And that has to be factored into the design as well. So to your point, if someone is even more heated, that may impact things as well. So it's an excellent point. Yeah.
So it's not a current source, it's not a voltage source. So what is the source resistance of the battery?
So the battery has its internal, right, the battery has an internal resistance.
Relatively high.
So that's a great question.
So medium range, I'm guessing like maybe 1.
It is something, first of all, that we can control to some extent, right? You can certainly, so you can easily increase the internal resistance of the device if you wanted to, right? You could start.
It shows it. It's a design criterion, specific spec, or?
The internal resistance is a factor that it goes into the design. It certainly is. I mean, you could, for example, choose to add one. You could, for example, choose to make one of these interconnects very high resistance. I mean, if you have enough voltage, right, you could sort of make a pseudo. So but then you're going to need more batteries. But all the cells themselves do have an internal resistance. It depends on like the electrolyte that you use, how much material that you use.
In the end, it must be that you have a known value, right? You put it into an ohmmeter and a current meter and you measure it.
Yes. For example, here, it's a good question. Here, for example, on this particular battery characterization, where is it? I'm going to estimate that it's about 1 kilo ohm, but that's exactly what this data would give you, right? So when you're drawing the current and you're seeing the voltage,
but it's not stable either, right? It must
it's not stable.
Right. So as it's changing, and you try to maintain some kind of current in the load,
right?
I'm not sure how that works out, because that curve is done ahead of time, right? And yet when it's discharging, you're not taking that into account, right?
Correct. So there's a lot of reasons why this might not have worked. So to be clear, when we're measuring the skin, it's under constant current, not a dynamic current, which is what's going to happen, right? There's only a constant current, right? So it's a constant current, and the same thing is happening when we're discharging the batteries, right? So we're not discharging either with the correct trajectory that they would experience otherwise. But as you can find in this preprint, when we do this analysis and we run these simulations and then we test them, we find that they give us reasonable ability to predict what happens, at least enough to help us design these to optimize the battery design. It's really what we need. We have so many parameters that we don't know how to tune. We use this kind of simulation to try to decide, should it be 4 batteries or 3 batteries? You can have 3 batteries of one type and 1 battery of another type, right? You can, for example, have a battery that's designed to fail early. So that's the one that's going to sort of limit things, right? While the other ones more supply the voltage. So that's where we use this type of analysis. Otherwise, I think we would be in a... But I agree with you, and I was honestly, I was very happy when the recordings we saw, right? So when we validate it, right? We make a version of this where we can record the voltage and we can tap into the current, right? So we're just monitoring. We're not doing anything. We can put it on so we can validate what is the voltage, what is the current. And at least the applications we've looked at so far, I was surprised at how well this theory worked for the reasons you said.
So I have a follow-up question. So on the load of the patient, right, it's the skin, but really the load is the interface, not so much the skin.
Right.
So it's a gel / the very top surface of the dead cell layer of the skin. So as the current is passing, you get charge accumulation in there.
Correct.
That's changing. Can you do something with that gel?
Yes.
Change its properties to improve the...
Exactly. So when we say load, I need to be very clear. I don't mean just the body. I mean the hydrogel and also the stimulation electrode, right? The metal there. So when we are measuring the load, it has to be not just on the right body part with the right separation, but with the particular hydrogel in the metal that we're going, because obviously I could use a high resistance hydrogel, a low resistance hydrogel, and as you know, right, the metal itself is being corroded during the stimulation, right? In fact, if you look, I don't know if you can see it here. I wonder if it comes in. If you actually do this experiment, you would often see that the voltage initially drops because of the body, but then it starts to rise as you get more and more impedance from the device itself. And so my answer is, and you know how complicated that is. The way we factor it in is when we do this load characterization, it's entirely specific to the interface and how we place it, and did we clean the skin, and so on. So what we're also doing is we're spending a lot of time on the design of the hydrogels themselves and the stimulation electrodes themselves. Like one of the things, for exactly that reason. We're trying to minimize that contribution.
Marom, do you have a clear clinical application that you're kind of thinking about from a next step translational perspective, or what's kind of the clinical application vehicle that's going to allow this technology to move to the next step?
That is as I'm sure you appreciate better than anybody. That is partially technical consideration, but it's also partially like a financial and strategic indication. I can tell you right now, I'm excited about the wound healing. These devices need only a single cell or 2 cells, so they're actually they're very small devices. And I'm very excited about the rodent work, and we've already reached out to centers. These are like dermatology departments that can then run these trials in human beings. It's not a massive gap to do that. But then even then you could say, well, which wounds? Is it going to be diabetic ulcers? Or is it going to be post-surgical? Or is it going to be other things? And I don't know how to address that. What's that?
Bed sores.
Or bed sores. Bed sores kill people, right? But this is very close to me because I've been working on this for a long time. We know that there are devices that are currently FDA cleared to go on the forehead for migraine. They both have a preventative, and you can use it on demand. So this is already FDA cleared. You're getting multiple devices in this space. So that's an example where the idea is you already have the device, and every time you have to attach it to an electrode, what if there was no device and you could just use the electrode? They're not always, though, they're not necessarily DC devices. I'm excited about it as well, and this was a bit of a weird, to use it for drug delivery. There's regulatory reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, but we have talked to people, for example, who are interested in vaccines.
You mentioned the cost of scale coming down to about a quarter. How does that compare to, well, I think that's the relevant question when you talk about what types of wounds or things like that. Because you want somebody that's ready to pay $2.50 instead of 10 cents for a Band-Aid.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're asking the right questions of someone who's actually had to make products before. What we have confidence on right now are things like the cost of goods. So I can tell you I've used this much hydrogel, I've used this much conductive carbon, and so we have exact amounts, and it's tiny amounts of active material, by the way. So you could add all those up, right, and you could estimate what would be the cost per gram, and then you would have to add some sort of multiple, right, for the manufacturing. But there's a lot of estimates built into that. So that is the next, what I'm happy to say is we know our cost of goods is very low. And we know that we've designed these in principle to use sort of established additive, right? Maybe it's sheet to sheet, maybe it's continuous roll manufacturing. But we would need to work with industrial designers to really know that. And I should also mention, by the way, when we talk about environmentally benign, sometimes you may say the materials are environmentally benign, but the way you make them is spectacularly toxic. So again, we've also tried to avoid manufacturing techniques that by their very nature are extremely toxic in terms of their byproducts as well. And so that's where I think we are green in product and green in process. But until you scale it, you don't, to your point, you don't know, right? Yeah.
So thinking about clinical translation, let's say you have one application, but your population, I guess like the size of that person might vary a lot. In terms of form factor, are you pretty limited, or like can you change out these different batteries so that you have the same, I guess, like dosing, so it's the same current profile for the same amount of time? that you're able to shrink the form factor, or are you pretty limited in terms of?
Yeah, that's another really great question. Right, it would depend. I mean, there's things like Band-Aids where you could imagine you might get away with something very universal, but we're discovering that's not the case for technology like this. So I have a version of it here, but essentially what these look like is they go like this and they sit across the forehead. And it turns out that if you really want something that sits across someone's forehead, it's very hard to make a one-size-fits-all. So in that particular application, we had to do some analysis about what is the normal variation across people's foreheads and what is the minimum number of sizes that we can get away with. So in that case, for example, we're thinking we may need 3 sizes in order to accommodate, I don't know what it is, right, 99% of people. So there are situations, I think, where you might be a one-size-fits-all, and there may be other situations where you may need to adjust the electrode separation, but maybe not necessarily we're assuming maybe not necessarily the battery pack itself. But I don't think this would be too much of a burden because when you buy it, you'd say, oh, there's the medium and there's the large, and you'd kind of figure out that you are a large. Yeah.
I kind of want to make a point that what's the benefit of making TDCS as disposable and one-time use? Because when you think of the efficacy of TDCS, you have to deliver repetitively for a lot longer period of time. So to see the change in the behavior or see any benefit, but if you use it like in a disposable, are there any known effect right now? If you use this TDCS one time and then you immediately improve like in terms of behavior?
So one of the advantages of things like TDCS, as opposed to things like, for example, transcranial magnetic stimulation or even electroconvulsive therapy, is that TDCS can be done at home, right? And so, to your point, if the course of therapy is 5 days per week for 6 weeks, the patient burden, right, of having to drive to the other side of Cleveland, park your car, walk through this black ice, right? Wait in line 20 minutes to see the doctor, but he's not there, so you wait an hour just to get a 20-minute session, right? And then you have to go home. So that is the burden of in-clinic treatments, whereas at home, you're watching television, oh, it's time, and you just put it on. So TDCS does lend itself to that, though again, TDCS is currently done with devices, right? And so right away, I think to have a bandage, right, provided you could provide the dose and the control you wanted, right, has its advantages. I know that's not your exact question. Your exact question is, what about a single session, right? So something else we've started to, when we started to do this particular project, we had optimized these electrodes for some of the issues that Dominique was talking about for tolerability. And we sort of discovered something else. We discovered that we could go to much higher currents and it would still be tolerable. So it was a secondary aspect of this. So through working on this, we discovered that we could go up to 6 milliamps and I think more, and the stimulation would still be tolerated. So now you have a situation of doing a single session of TDCS at a much higher dose than was previously used. And so to your question, maybe that would produce a more immediate mood effect, which maybe doesn't, it's like this for depression. It doesn't treat the depression, but it gives you a experience that encourages you to remain compliant, right? Compliance is a big issue, right? With a lot of things, right? I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
You just mentioned 6 milliamps, but what is sort of the highest current you can achieve with this stuff for how long?
Right, it was interesting. I was having dinner with Dominique last night and we were talking about it. It used to be thought that when you're doing non-invasive electrical stimulation, right, especially with things like direct current stimulation, the limit had to do with tolerability. So initially people said, you can't go above 2 milliamp, it's gonna hurt too much. And then we said, oh, look, we could just optimize it. And when they started, this was, without exaggeration, like kitchen sponges soaked in water. We said, okay, we can do, right? I went to Case, I'm a biomedical engineer. I can do better than kitchen sponges soaked in water, maybe, right? It took us a few years, but okay, then we got to 4 milliamp, right? And so now we're saying 6 milliamp. And so now there's something very interesting that's gonna happen. At some point, we're gonna say the limits of these techniques is no longer governed by tolerability, as in ouch. We can get to the point where perhaps it's a 2 out of 10 uncomfortableness, and so now we have to have other rules in order to apply brakes, right? So if my student says, well, I want to do 12 milliamp today, oh, I want to do 20 milliamp today, I just find that whenever you're thinking about safety, you always need like the thing that like with transcranial magnetic stimulation, their goal is to avoid seizures. And their general rule of thumb is as long as I avoid the seizures, go for it. You know what I mean? Like that's their mark, right? And maybe in other cases we have charge injection limits or other things. But if we have something like TDCS, where the main side effects are itching and tingling, you have to now start thinking a lot about, well, where am I going to set those barriers, and then you get into issues of risk benefit and other issues. So I don't have a simple answer for that, but we are now there where you can certainly apply. You can get to these higher intensities where maybe different consideration. It's no longer it's no longer ouch. That's the breaks. Yeah.
On that similar note, you're saying that you're replacing some of the current control systems with a margin of error. Do you think that poses a challenge for regulatory pathway and transition?
It's a really, really good question. So if you look at the, no matter what we do, our discharge, this is an older trace, it's a little bit better, but now it's never going to be as good as pure current control. And so the question is, what does that mean as far as, for example, FDA? There are situations where the FDA has been willing to accept, I don't know the term, something a little bit more loosey-goosey, a different kind of standard, I would say. So for example, there are, iontophoreser, there are currently iontophoreser patches. Now they use a coin cell battery and a little circuit, like a little microcontroller in them, right, in order to work. But nonetheless, they're like a single package, right? And they are, if you buy them, they'll say stuff like high dose or low dose, and what they mean is like charge. And they sort of like, they work by sort of depleting the battery in a particular way, right? In a not maybe ideal way. And so I think there maybe are predicate, that's at least one predicate where the FDA seemed to be willing to accommodate something where, okay, there's a current range and there's a duration range, but we're not going to mandate that level of precision. I think also at the end, though, it will come down to the demonstration of safety and efficacy, right? So if we make these devices for TDCS at whatever it is at 4 milliamps, and if we run an appropriately designed trial, we should be able to demonstrate to them, right, the right balance of efficacy and safety that would hopefully address that concern. But yeah, it is a new world where we have to accept that it's not, it's not perfect. It's not going to be perfectly controlled anymore. Yeah.
All right, I think we have to stop.
Okay, thanks.